Welcome everyone to the RAPS webcast, Writing Effective Test Reports and Persuasive Test Summaries, sponsored by Med Institute. My name is Joanne Wan and I'll be your host for today's webcast. Please be advised that this webcast is being recorded for on-demand access. And before we begin, a few housekeeping items to go over. For sound, please be sure to check the volume setting on your device or your headset to ensure you're getting full audio. At the bottom of your screen are multiple widgets for you to utilize. You can view your slides in full screen by clicking on the maximize icon on the top right of the slides. You can move and resize almost all of the widgets that are open on your screen. And if you have any questions during the webcast, please click on the Q&A and submit your questions at any time, and we will address them after the presentation. A copy of today's slides can be found in the resource widget, and if you have any technical difficulty, please click on the help widget. The icon is a question mark, and it covers common technical issues. And at this time, I'd like to turn this over to your first presenter, Dan Dillon.
Hi, I'm Dan Dillon with Med Institute. Thanks for listening in on this webcast, Writing Effective Test Reports and Persuasive Test Summaries. Just a comment here. It's been interesting as this presentation has evolved in our own mind. I wanted to have a presentation that involves somebody from our engineering group because I just think there's a lot of good interactions that can occur. Sometimes there's not so good interactions that occur between regulatory and engineering. And it's been interesting because we've been thinking about this exclusively in terms of writing things, but Justin's going to bring some basic knowledge on things that are important so that you have good tests in the first place. So that'll be very interesting. So moving to the first major slide. Joanne, all of a sudden I'm having trouble moving the slides. Hold on here. There we go. Okay, thanks, Joanne. Sorry. So the objectives for today is understand the basic elements of an effective test report, basic elements of a good test summary, key strategies and tactics for writing persuasively in a regulated environment, and examples, case studies as time permits. We did the dry run on this, and we think we gave too many examples. Hopefully most of them are explanatory, so depending upon the pacing here, we may just skip through some of those examples, and we want to leave time for questions. If there's a particular example you want to ask, then we can always do that during the chat time. So that's sort of the thought on how we're going to proceed. First, a few introductions, a little bit about Med, a little bit about me, and a little bit about Justin. So Med Institute is a Cook company. For 30 years, over 30 years, we supported Cook Medical as sort of an in-house CRO. And from time to time, we helped other companies in development. And about 2 years ago, we decided to 100% focus on helping other companies. So since then, we've been offering expertise in medical device engineering, regulatory submissions, and clinical study management. It's really been exciting to meet lots of new people, help with new products, but at the same time able to bring them 30 years of success from the world's largest privately held medical device manufacturer. So, Justin, you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Justin Metcalf. I have a couple of engineering degrees from Purdue University and have worked on many Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices over the last 15 years. Many of those were first to market, so we got to learn firsthand how to set requirements and move a medical device through the development process. We've done some standards work on our team, and then I manage a diverse team that maintains a ISO 17025 R&D lab.
So I've been trained in engineering, medicine, and statistics, have a master's in statistics. 27 years in regulatory affairs, the past 10 at Cook Medical, a wide variety of submissions, multiple technology platforms. When you work for different companies, you learn about different technologies. I think I've dealt with about a third of the FDA branches over time, but they keep on changing the branches, so that's hard to keep track of. But multiple technology platforms. I teach at a regulatory submissions course at Purdue, and I'm part of Cook Medical's FDA policy group, so from time to time I get to have a face-to-face meeting with senior FDA officials to talk about policy matters. So we're going to ask a few questions that help understand our audience a little bit better. This is sort of the raising of the hand. so online. We've been told you have a way of responding to these that will help us out here. So our first question is, what's your main area of activity? Medical device, pharmaceutical, biologics, combination products, or others? So pick one. If you've got multiple people listening in on a connection, which I suspect, if you wouldn't mind just choosing the most common one. So I guess at this point, Joanne, they go ahead and vote, and then you tell me when you've got the votes tallied up or enough. So we'll be quiet and let you choose one of those four options.
There are the results.
Okay. Mostly medical device, but still a big chunk of pharma and everything. So a majority, but not too much of a majority. Hey, our expertise is in medical device at Med Institute, but we think some of this stuff can apply to more than just medical devices because the essence of this is you're dealing with a regulated environment, and how do you talk persuasively in that environment? Second question. Hey, how many non-regulatory people are listening? We are hoping to attract more than just regulatory people because I think that's interesting. But it could be that your answer is nobody. Everybody in the room is regulatory. Maybe it's 1 to 3. Maybe it's 4 to 6. Maybe it's 7 or more people. So be curious to have an answer to that question. Okay, so 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7. That's still a fair amount of people that are outside of regulatory, so we really appreciate that. The other thing we should say is our talk is primarily about is testing, which is primarily bench, but we think this same sort of discussion can also apply to clinical and animal. We certainly use those same principles when we do our writing. Then last question, years of experience in the industry. Again, if you've got multiple people, just sort of choose a range that's your best guess of the median or the average in the room. So, this is not a right or wrong quiz. There's no penalty for failure. So what's your answer here? Okay. Well, that's impressive. We got a lot of folks that have 10 or more years experience in regulatory affairs. So I hope this is helpful. I guess I wouldn't mind some feedback maybe afterwards for folks who've had a lot of experience, whether this was a helpful presentation or whether it was something that was merely, yeah, I've heard this before, thanks, that was a waste of time. So we are trying to help. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Justin, and he's going to talk about basic elements of an effective test report.
Hey, it's Justin. When Dan asked me to help how to write an effective test report, I said, okay, but you're going to have to let me talk about what it takes to produce a good test report and where are some of the areas that add complexity to this process. Okay. So as this slide shows, testing a medical device for safety is complex. The bar keeps getting raised on us and in our society, and failures and complaints add expense and risk to our jobs. Some examples of areas where complexity can enter are acceptance criteria or overall risk uncertainty. For example, what I mean here is a lack of clinical evidence or a lack of understanding of how the device affects the end user. Another area of complexity is lack of planning or not planning correctly. For example, not planning for enough time or the possibility of failure or possible issues that will strain our development process. Poor communication or project management. This is a big area for me personally. I've seen project managers hinder device development by either having too many of them or poor project management overall. These days, I can almost tell you that if a device is going to make it based on the project manager themselves. When we started building our R&D lab, we didn't appreciate the benefits of method validation, and after receiving ISO 7025 accreditation, we now understand that medical device method validation is important even in the early R phase as it helps you communicate your ideas effectively with a sound scientific backing to the regulatory bodies. Device failures is another area. When they're not easily understood, they can either be caused by a test or the design or manufacturer, and that adds complexity. So not understanding your device failures or being able to talk about them clearly and effectively. A term we use is quality system scar tissue, which means to us an overall specific quality system that worked years ago but doesn't work in today's world. Since we split our engineering team services from Cook to offering those services to others, we've had the opportunity to revisit our quality system several times and add efficiencies based on customer needs. And I would like to advise your engineering team to revisit their quality system on a periodic basis. And lastly, but maybe most importantly, is a misalignment with regulatory expectations or requirements. This can add great complexity. For example, a device that has been approved before and had the risk identified on the market, and you didn't understand those or appreciate those are going to be applied to your device by the regulatory body.
Yeah, so if I understand this right, Justin, you have a device failure, and the question would be, is it something wrong with the test, or is it something wrong with the device? And then the flip side of that is with method validation. You can have a test, and hey, it passed the test, but then you ask yourself, well, does the test actually detect any kind of failures? And unless you have a valid method, now you're stuck with saying, well, I'm not sure my test. So either your test isn't good enough because it doesn't catch bad things, or your test isn't good enough because it creates bad things that it shouldn't create.
Yeah, or furthermore there, you didn't understand the uncertainty, you didn't use the right equipment, and the test overall isn't repeatable. So there's a lot that goes into method validation, and we could do a whole talk about that. Next, the flip side of that is sometimes everything can be simple, and you can move your device through the development process fairly simply. Just a quick few points here. Maintaining flexibility is key because sometimes the best plans can go to waste. Don't forget to look for formal test plans and project plans that are maintained by strong project management. Again, method validations and feasibility data give everyone assurance that the pivotal tests or the DV tests are going to go smoothly. Quality system that is designed and works for you. We're all pretty smart people, and a quality system that doesn't work for us, we'll find a way around it. So make sure that quality system is actually working and in place. And then refine that quality system as you go. And of course, regulatory cohesion with the regulatory authority. So working things out and communicating effectively with them. Next slide. Now that we move through that, this is how our engineering team thinks about an effective test report and building the foundation for that effective test report. These key processes that we have identified under effective test reports are as follows. As my mentor would say, a good test report is worth 1,000 words, and a bad test report can cause regulatory people and even us thousands more words. As engineers, we really do try to make your life as easy as possible, and having a foundation like this of calibration processes, training and competence of our operators, method validation, formal and feasibility testing processes, and of course good design controls and design history files are some ways that we can make sure research and development will stand up as it moves through the regulatory submission process. One more quick slide on the quality system that I thought was worth mentioning. A common question that we get as an R&D lab is what kind of QMS should I expect from my medical device testers? And further, we often get asked if we run a GLP lab or some other QMS. So there are, of course, basic engineering or best practices that we follow when conducting any experiment. For medical devices, we take this a few steps further. A lab performs a GLP test if we can't control or validate the test system. So GLPs are laws that are built around assurance or compliance to the governing QSRs. Then what we use is an ISO 17025 system. This standard is for physical and chemical tests where we can ensure method validation, method uncertainty, and overall measurement repeatability. So the FDA has confirmed that GLP is not intended for physical and chemical tests and is for animal, plants, and microorganisms in correspondence to the GLP updates that are in progress. And you can still claim compliance to GLPs for physical and chemical tests, but in my opinion, the benefits of method validation in accordance with ISO 7025 outweigh GLP compliance. So you can read the GLP regs, ISO 7025 standard, or other best practice documents on your own and come up with your own elements of an effective test report. This is what we've come up with our company's history and has global regulatory acceptance. I'll read that off to you. Is the purpose clear? Do you have traceability of the test articles? And are the devices representative of the final device? Why did you choose the samples you chose? Why did you choose to test that many? Where did the acceptance criteria come from, and why is it clinically relevant? Are the methods from a standard, some other reference like a scientific paper or guidance document, and are there any departures from those? Did you choose the right method and equipment to get the results you desired? Who did the work and who signed off on the work, and what are those people's qualifications? Did you use calibrated equipment that was adequate for the job? Were there any deviations again, and what documentation practices did you follow? And then conclusions with pass-fail results, and all supported by sound scientific data. So my last slide highlights how you would put the previous elements into a working document set. We like prospective protocols with acceptance criteria when appropriately defined before testing. We like the data to be standalone in case things change or you want to write a different report in the future. We like to wrap everything up in a standalone report that is intended for a global regulatory submission. And of course, you need SOPs or instructions providing validation documentation and did you do what you said you did. So now we're done with testing and we're moving into what Dan's going to talk about.
Basic elements of a good test summary. So the testing is done, but the work is not yet done. What are test summaries? So it's hard to maybe have a different impression in different people's minds what this means, but let's just try to be clear about this. So you've got a bunch of test reports. You're ready to send in your submission to a regulatory person. They're sitting at their desk. They've got a stack of papers or else a stack of electronic documents. And all those test reports are great because they're compliant with whatever regulations they're supposed to be compliant with, and they have the complete information. Every fact that might matter, you've probably included in those test reports. You're certainly not hiding anything. So you put them all together into a regulatory submission, and in front of all those test reports, before you get to the test reports, are administrative information like who are you, what's your address, et cetera. Regulatory information like what's the class, what are some comparators, perhaps substantial equivalence, that sort of thing. And then a product description, hopefully somewhere in there to say this is what it is. Labeling, you could have manufacturing sections depending upon the submission. So you put all those test reports attached to your regulatory submission and you send it off to the reviewer. And one of the things I learned early on is that is a recipe for potential disaster, simply because you've done an awful lot of work. It could be 3 engineers over the course of a couple of years. It could be 30 or 100 people over the course of 5 to 10 to 15 years. And now you have a reviewer or maybe a team of reviewers that only barely begin to understand what you're doing. And so this is the first part of this, is there's an understanding gap. But the other thing is a regulatory submission is not just a technical document. Okay, this is, I think, an important point. It's a policy document. And that may sound strange to your ears. In fact, when I sent this around for review, that was one of the questions. What do you mean by a policy document? Well, it's true. You're not sending in a submission to determine some policy on every single defibrillator or every single sterilized device or every single EEG monitor. But you are putting in front of them data that they have to use to make a policy decision on your device. Do I want to allow this device to go to market? Do I want this device to be allowed to be used in a clinical study? So it's not just about the data, it's about its interpretation, and its interpretation in a regulatory framework. So that's why at least as we've written submissions, there's always, before you send in test reports, test summaries, something that helps the reviewer connect the test reports to the rest of the submission, but also connect those test reports to the accumulation of data that the reviewer sees in order to make a decision that this product is worth going to the market, it's ready going to the market, the risks have been minimized, the benefits are acceptable. Whatever the regulatory standard is, you are gently persuading the person that's reading this that, yes, this is acceptable going to the market. I've seen the disaster. Actually, about a year and a half ago, we picked up a project from another consulting firm. The client got rid of them because they read the regulations and said, oh, this is what you need in an IDE. So they just threw everything in the IDE without any interpretation, without any guide. And it's the first time I've ever heard of FDA refusing to receive an IDE. Usually, they'll refuse to accept a 510K or a PMA if it's not administratively complete. But this was so bad that the FDA said, really, we don't even want to read this. Can we just turn this into an informal meeting and we can talk about it? Yeah. So having some way of helping the FDA interpret the data, that's what test summaries do for you. So what do good test summaries include? Well, they sort of look in a sense like a test report because they've got a purpose statement, acceptance criteria, including clinical justification, description of test articles, including why you justify those articles, sample size, summary of test method, including maybe a justification of the test environment, results, including sometimes raw data or statistical summaries, conclusions, and tables. FDA loves tables. If anything, you've got a lot of data, try to put it in a table. FDA just loves that. But you'll notice there's some asterisks there that says sometimes you combine things into one section, or because really, good test summaries are as much art as anything else. It's not a straitjacket that they have to be in this order in this way, unless there's regulatory requirements. Then so be it. But even then, I'd encourage you to think how to work with that requirement of a certain order and make sure that your message and your story is coming through. So, these are elements of a good test summary. They're not necessarily have to be in this fixed order. So what doesn't it include? Here's the things that, you might think, oh, FDA, they're in the test report, and they should be, but they don't really need to be in a test summary. You don't want to start off by saying, oh, by the way, this was done in compliance with design control. I mean, it should be done in compliance with design control, but simply saying it's in compliance with design control doesn't demonstrate that the product is safe or that it's effective. Likewise, things like location and data, the testing and the report, or who's doing the testing, important things to have in your test report because that's part of traceability and responsibility. But really, FDA doesn't care a whole lot about who does the test. It could be done by a third party. It could have been done 10 years ago. But if it's relevant, it still matters, and that's what you want to talk about. You want to talk about the data and its interpretation. So same thing, batch, lot, serial numbers, not really critical. It doesn't mean a whole lot to FDA if you introduce a test by saying we tested lots number XYZ1, KYZ5, and ABC10. They have no reference. They don't know what that means. Important for traceability, but not for a test summary. So a lot of times I'll just say, hey, lot 1, lot 2, lot 3. And then refer them back to the test report if need be. Same thing with test equipment. It's not really important to have the brands there. If you're dealing with FDA, to tell them that it complies with an international standard that they haven't recognized, not relevant, might even backfire. And then it's a really raw data. You generally try to avoid giving them reams of paperwork that's hard to interpret in a test summary. You may have to send it in, for instance, with an animal test. They usually require all the raw data, but you don't need to do that in your summary. And there's a couple of things that you definitely don't want to do, and in fact, if you see them in test reports, you probably want to sit down with the test engineer and say, can you change that? Because you don't want to have statements like, more testing is needed. That's a project update. It might be due to the weather. The failures might be due to the weather. Again, that's pure speculation. It doesn't belong in a test report. Project-related summaries. Yeah, we'll work on this failure in the next test. I've seen that a few times, and that's been a problem. And, I guess it can be in there if you can say, and oh, by the way, in your test summary, the next report we're showing you actually fixes that problem. But in general, you sort of want to avoid those things, and definitely in test summaries. You should be telling a better story than that. So let's go over some of the elements. A good test summary for the purpose, just usually 1 or 2 sentences, something like the purpose of this test is to test the tensile strength of such and so joint, or the purpose of the test is to simulate the use of the product. If the test is novel or the significance of the test isn't really clear, Now you may need some background to talk about it. So you may need a paragraph. And that paragraph may not be in the test report. So you're going to have to sit down with the engineer and say, well, why was this test done? And try to put that down on paper. Don't talk about equipment or methods in the purpose section. You're just distracting them. But it is good to talk about FDA-recognized consensus standards. If the FDA expects you to test accordance with ISO 123, then tell them that as soon as you can, because that'll just make them feel that much better about it. Acceptance criteria. Clear statements of criteria are important. Clinical justification if it's not obvious. And again, here's another thing that may not be in the test report. It may be in a design input. The design input says, well, it has to be 15 pounds because of this. Well, tell that to the FDA in your test summary to say that this is the acceptance criteria. And sometimes if it's really kind of hard to explain the acceptance criteria until you've explained the methods, you'll put the acceptance criteria at the end of the methods section. It helps also to indicate what the statistics are of this. When you say that something has to be above 10, does that mean every unit has to be above 10 or some statistical sample above 10 or the average above 10? So try to be clear on that. So, this is a good time to talk about statistical assumptions. Sometimes it should go in the methods. So test articles. Again, make it real clear, you tested 12 finished sterilized devices. That's the best case. I tested X of the finished device, and they were sterilized if sterilization is important. Always good. But that very often doesn't happen. You can have prototypes, previous design generations, component subassemblies. You could have similar products. You may pull a test from 10 years ago on a similar product and say, look, that's all we need to do. We don't need to redo this testing. So it could be an awful long variation of list of variations about why you have to test it. And you also need to make it clear why they don't impact the interpretation or application of the test results. So, we tested a component because the rest of the device outside that component simply doesn't affect how that particular component works in that way. So you'll sometimes have to justify why you choose only certain sizes. So if you've got a variety of lengths and diameters, you'll choose the 4 corners. And sometimes that gets to be a paragraph long. And again, it may not be in the test report, so you've got to describe it so that test report gets received well. So sample size justification, again, may or may not be in a separate section. Sometimes it's just as simple if it's a sample size of 12 and 12 is somewhat arbitrary, just hook that up with the test article section and be done with it. It's good to show, as I said, statistical justification, but don't try to teach them statistics. One of the difficult things about sample size justification that FDA likes to push on is there's sometimes a misunderstanding, especially with young reviewers. A lot of medical device testing is just one. It's type testing. It's assumed that if you can test the one and it passes, that repeatability is just not going to be an issue. So you have to say, hey, we chose one because that's typical for this, and it's okay by the standard. Sometimes it's 3 or 3 lots. And why 3 lots? Well, because it's more than 2. Hate to say that. That's the answer. It's pretty common in process validation, and a lot of times manufacturers will combine process validation with final design validation, and so that's why it's 3 lots. A lot of times it's just an arbitrarily large number, and there's really not a whole lot of justification, but hey, it's large, so that's probably a good thing. And so a lot of times, to be honest, if there's not really a clear justification, I'll sometimes not write a sample size section. The protocol or the test report might have a sample size saying 12, but if it doesn't really have a clear justification, I would skip it in a summary. Okay, so next, test methods. Justifying your model. Again, this could take a whole paragraph, and it may not be in the report. You've got to explain why this particular model is an excellent way. That some of that information may be buried in the method validation. You need to say, we chose this model because preliminary testing showed that, and explain that, and so now FDA can have that comfort. And to be honest, maybe once, I can't remember any, but maybe once we've had an instance where FDA has said, we want to see that method validation. But a lot of cases, you simply say, preliminary data shows this works, and they're usually okay with that. Okay, so you're supposed to summarize the test method, but don't get into the kind of excruciating detail you might need for a test report. So give an example there, right? You don't have to say 3 steps on a stopcock. You say add 40 milliliters. And again, important equipment, environmental test conditions need to be mentioned, but here's a couple examples where The protocol of the report may mention specific brands, but all you need to say is it's controlled climate. The luminosity was ranged from 5 to 40 kilolux, and you don't even have to mention the equipment because it's not critical. It'll be in the report if they want to see the detail. You're just trying to lay the groundwork for it. Results. So another pet peeve, results section should be results only. Don't put acceptance criteria, don't put methods, don't show how you calculated. All that should have already been set up. It's okay to explain one-offs, but don't say, and that's okay, that's interpretation, that's for the conclusion. Meeting the acceptance criteria isn't even a result, that's a conclusion. And pass is not a result, pass is a conclusion. So if you have a report where it's sort of, or a test where it's sort of go, no go, okay, it passed the first obstacle, we tried this and it did that fine, and then we did this and it did that fine, then say, it did fine. The catheter slipped or the catheter didn't slip. Don't say it passed that test. Okay, you can save that for conclusions. Always good to report data in tables with means and standard deviation, and a range is pretty common. You can sometimes do individual data, but don't overload your summary with all that data. You're just trying to give them a general sense of, hey, this data was acceptable. This data shows the device is great. And then let them dig into the test report for any details. And then conclusions. Okay, conclusions is where you interpret the results. You want to state whether the results met the acceptance criteria. And if not, you need to explain why they're nonetheless acceptable. And we've done this numerous times in my career where you might feel like, oh, no, I need to say the acceptance criteria are fine and we met them and don't want to give them all that detail. No, go ahead. You can go ahead and talk about the fact that something wasn't perfect, but it was still okay. Now, but on the other hand, if you get this test report and you can't explain the results or they don't look acceptable, that's the time to go back to your engineering team and say, what's going on here? Because I guess you feel good about it because you signed the report, but I'm not understanding this at all. And that's a big clue of why test summaries are important, because somebody has to help explain to FDA why this is true. Maybe they can modify their test report, but maybe it's simplest just to explain it up front. So again, remind the reader of the relevance of the results. I think it's useful to include with some sort of broader regulatory interpretive statement, something you wouldn't find in necessarily the test report. Like these data provide reasonable assurance of safety with respect to, say, biocompatibility, or reasonable assurance of the performance of the device. Or this test confirms the acceptability that the labeling can state that the performance conditions are this, if you're talking about a particular claim. One of my favorites is this provides substantial evidence of whatever the characteristic you're measuring. It's not that, you don't want to say that something proves this, because a lot of people will react to the word proof in terms of this massively decisive, can't be argued with conclusion. And that may be true, and it may be true in your mind, but it's not necessarily the way to approach a regulatory agency. You have to let them come to the conclusion that it proves it. So those are some thoughts on conclusions. Having walked through the 7 or 8 sections that we outlined, let's talk about some strategies and tactics for writing persuasively in a regulatory environment. So here's some good technical writing principles. These are the sorts of things that you get hammered into your head when you go to a day-long course on technical writing. You can take, long-term courses, 3-credit courses. You can get a degree in technical writing. So we're not going to try to teach all that, but some of these basic points are a good framework to talk about some things that are specific to regulatory submissions. So knowing your story, knowing your audience, clarity, completeness, conciseness, consistency, correctness, those are some standard formulations. You're always told use active voice and use positive statements and avoid long sentences. Actually, we'll talk about this a little later on the slides. I'm not convinced about active voice and long sentences. I think there's some unique aspects to regulatory submissions. And then sort of from a practical operational standpoint, do your paragraphs have unity, coherence, and continuity? Are the sentences logical, vigorous, and clear? Are the words precise, simple, necessary, and scholarly? Again, we're not going to try to teach a technical writing course here, but there are some things we've learned along the way that I think are helpful. And one of this is, what kind of a story is a regulatory submission? There's a bit of tongue-in-cheek in here, but a bit of seriousness, too. It's not a sales and marketing tool. You are not trying to sell the FDA to buy this device. That's not what FDA is doing. They're trying to balance risk versus benefit, safety versus effectiveness, etc. It's not a dramatic novel. So as much as you might be excited and think this device is going to be a groundbreaker or a world breaker and all these exciting things about your device, all you need to tell the agency is, look, it's safe and effective. That's, it's good. You may want to get them a little bit interested to realize this is worth paying attention to, but don't get it too amped up. It's also not a mystery novel, which means we don't hide things. Okay, we don't have FDA go looking for things. If there's something that may be troublesome in a test report or somewhere else, let's just talk about it up front in your test summary or somewhere else and say, look, this is maybe unusual in your mind, but here's why we think it's acceptable. That's not necessarily the precise language I'd use, but that's what you're trying to communicate. It's also not a mystery novel in that you don't want the answer to come at the end. You don't want to say, hey, we found a problem, but don't worry, if you read Appendix K, that solves it. If you say we found a problem, then you need to say, and here's the solution to it. And you need to say it right away, and then tell them details are in Appendix K. And then finally, this is sort of what it is. It's your one and only best opportunity to persuade an agency to a particular course of action based on data and policy. And I chose those words carefully because you only get one chance for a good first impression. And that is so absolutely key, which is why we spend a lot of time doing regulatory writing, because just about everybody else in life, if they have a big thing they're trying to persuade of somebody else, gets to stand in front of them and say, hey, I'm going to give you this presentation. Stop me if you have any questions. And that's not how it works in the regulatory world. You write it up, you send it in, and they start reading it. So it's your one and only best opportunity to persuade them that, yes, please approve my device, and it requires a lot of work up front. So some details about knowing your regulatory story. Even if the submission doesn't require an executive summary, make sure you have one. You don't have to call it that, but make sure you have some way of having the reviewer navigate what you're about to give them. If there's not an explicit section for that, then put it in the cover letter, especially if there's just something unique about this in terms of past history with the agency or other devices, or you're pleading for some special case. You've got to be able to work them through, hey, this is our device, and here's some interesting things you're going to see about it, and all this together is something that leads us to a conclusion of its approvability. Second point, make sure that your product description and labeling do a good job of, quote, setting up your test reports. So if 5 or 6 of your test reports have to do with specific components, make sure your device description describes those components well enough that when you're talking about those test reports in your test summary, the reviewer can refer back and say, oh, okay, now I understand. So if you've got 10 or 15 joints in your device that you're going to test, well, then make sure you describe those joints in your device description. And likewise, the labeling should be consistent. It's one of the important points that if you're going to test a claim, you have to make sure, hey, this is what we're claiming on the device, and make sure that you're connecting your test report. And then finally, yes, make positive statements. Again, we'll probably say this is like the 3rd or 4th time we've said this. It's worth saying over again. Move the reviewer to a conclusion that he or she can approve or clear or authorize this product or study because the data and the labeling of the device and whatever other additional regulatory controls, put that all together, means that this device meets regulatory requirements. That's the story you're trying to tell. Know your technical story. Okay, before you give the FDA, a whole bunch of testing, it's often useful to have some way of sort of putting it all together and say, look, we handled most of this with bench. Because the bench isn't sufficient, we decided to do a clinical study. Or we did an animal study, and this is what that animal study covered. Especially, though, with bench testing, where you may have 5, 15, 20 different bench tests, it's good to explain the overall approach to what you were doing. So describe how the bench testing supports performance characteristics, if your device description included that. Emphasize how the testing fulfills regulatory requirements. In particular, guidance documents. I remember writing up one submission for an intravascular stent, and that guidance document is 50 pages thick, 90 pages, something like that. And so I ended up writing up a big 11 by 17 table that summarized everything. So in one big gulp, FDA could look at that and say, yep, everything's okay. Yep, they covered everything. Thanks. So that sort of overall summary makes FDA or any other regulatory body feel very comfortable with, okay, these people understand what I need to see, and they're giving it to me that way. So you also use it as an opportunity to explain unusual tests or general approaches or repeated use of non-standard test articles. So, for instance, we talked about, look, not all the time do you use a finished device. You may use a previous generation or a prototype. And if you have 5 tests that use the same prototype, rather than writing a paragraph in your test summary that says, and here's why that's okay, and here's how it differs, and here's why that's okay, just put it in the overall test summary and say, hey, in 7 of the tests or 5 of the tests, we used a prototype, and this is what this prototype is about, and this is why it doesn't really matter for those tests. So that's just a communication strategy rather than, just talk about it up front. And a lot of what we're talking about, it's not a matter of necessarily being true or false, as much as helping the reviewer walk through this information that they're seeing for the first time. Know your audience. A typical reviewer, right? They have at least a bachelor's degree in science or engineering or a health-related field. They might be a doctor or a nurse. But they may not have any practical experience, and they may be familiar with your general field, but not necessarily your product. What's worse is that they're familiar with your competitor, and you're trying to make a point that you're different from your competitor. Or they have similar products, and all of a sudden they're borrowing from, oh, I remember, that's sort of like this, isn't it? So now you have a problem. So you've got to help that reviewer understand your product at a very basic level. That, of course, they have very different experiences from within your company. If they've been at the agency for 10 years, they've been reviewing an awful lot of devices, whereas you may have only worked on 1 or 2 devices, but you are the expert in that, and they are not. So knowing that audience means that you have to sit down and be really careful about how you explain things and be very clear about it. Plus, here's the added factor for regulatory people, and I'm not trying to be insulting here. This is just how it is, because this is what it is when you sign up to be a regulator. You could be risk adverse, right? I mean, you want to protect people, and so you're going to want to have a fairly high bar of prove to me this thing works. You and I have been walking through this project for years. We know it works. We're already convinced. We've already had hundreds of discussions about, is this the right testing? Is this the right inputs? Have we managed the risk? But the FDA is hearing it for the first time, so don't be surprised if they're risk adverse. They may be skeptical. They may have been burned in the past by something that happened, and so they just may not trust you. So you've got to be able to present yourself in a way that says, hey, we're giving you the whole truth, at least the truth that matters. We don't have to give you truth on previous generations of products that were 4 years away in R&D and don't have any effect on it, but this is our product, and this is how it works. And then research-oriented. Sometimes you get FDA people, especially if they come out of the research world, they want to ask those really cool research questions. They want to enlist you on doing that test. Hey, we want to do this IDE, and we want to do this as our population, and we want to do this as our endpoint, and they'll say, oh, that's really great. What about this population? What about this point? Have you considered this? Have you considered this? And those are great research questions, but they're not questions that are going to help you get to the endpoint of this device is safe and effective. Research is about asking more questions all the time. Regulatory submissions are about saying this product with these features, with this data, is acceptable and making an actual decision. So you've got to help them make that decision. Okay, another one of those factors is consistency, right? You're supposed to be consistent. So I'm going to do something a little dangerous here. I've got this 14-line description, and this paragraph demonstrates a common mistake in regulatory writing. I'm going to go silent for about, 20 or 30 seconds and let you read through that, and can you figure out what the problem is here? And Joanne, I don't know if we can do this, but I'd be nice to maybe have some people submit their answers via chat. I'm looking at the team chat. So I'll stop talking, and let's see what happens if some people can figure out what's wrong. Anybody on chat? Let's see now. I have somebody. Reasonable. Okay, let me take a look at this. Did we say reasonable? Okay, we'll go on to the next slide here just to sort of give the answers. Where does it say reasonable? Sorry. Oh, reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. Well, if you're in the device world, that is the standard for medical device approval. So reasonable assurance is a term of art, so I'm glad it's there. Well, the problem here is that we're calling the device a bunch of different things. Sometimes we call it an invention, sometimes we call it a device, sometimes we call it an endograft, sometimes we call it a graft, sometimes we call it a product, sometimes we call it an apparatus. That's just confusing. It kind of makes you wonder, are we talking about different things or are we talking about the same thing? And even the clinical study, it's called a clinical evaluation, it's called a trial, it's called a study. Which one is it? And some of those are terms of art, so you have to be very careful about what you describe things. So it's very interesting to see this as a fairly consistent problem in technical writing. Okay, so it's important to use the same word for the same thing. But there's actually a slight bit of an exception on this that sort of gets misunderstood. So here's a Cook device, and this is its full name, the Zenith TX2 TAA endovascular graft with Proform and the Z-Track Plus introduction system. So if you write a regulatory submission, somewhere up there in the header, you're going to say, this is the submission on the Zenith TX2 TAA endovascular graft with Proform and the Z-Track Plus introduction system. But every time you mention the device, you don't have to say that it's the 15-word name. That's going to take up an entire line every time you mention it. So it is acceptable to take smaller portions, like, okay, sometimes we're going to call it the Zenith TX2 TAA endovascular graft. Sometimes we'll call it the Zenith TX2 graft. Sometimes we'll just call it the Zenith graft, and sometimes we'll call it the graft. But please don't call it the device or the apparatus or anything else. Just figure out what your terms are, figure out what your long name is, your short name is, and work with that. So that's just sort of a, don't go from one extreme to another that you feel like you always have to use the longest possible string of letters to be specific. Okay, active voice and long sentences. I would contend that in a regulatory submission that you don't have to use active voice. In fact, it kind of gets in the way. It really doesn't matter if Cook tested this or that your company reviewed this or your company believes that something is acceptable. The submission is about the device. The device is the star. So the device gets tested. The drug gets tested. The biologic gets tested. Okay, the emphasis is on what was done, not who did it. So it's perfectly acceptable. And in fact, sometimes it's preferable because you don't necessarily want to talk about who did it. You don't necessarily want to talk about when it was done. You just want to say it was tested. And then sometimes long sentences are inevitable. It's just the way it is in the regulatory world because we have some fairly complex terms and we have some fairly complex concepts that we're trying to put together. And it's just hard to break it into multiple sentences, especially when there's long lists. And so sometimes people will tell you, oh, hey, you need to put those long lists into a bullet form, which can be helpful if you're trying to emphasize each one of those, or you're trying to show, okay, we did 6 different tests, list them out in bullets, and then you can say each of those tests are referred to in another section. But if you're simply trying to say we did a lot of work, we did a bunch of different things, then just write a big long sentence. It'll let FDA know, wow, they did a lot of work. And then clarity. Okay, here's a piece of advice. Have someone outside the project peer review the work. Okay, in fact, try to find somebody who's as far outside the project as you can. And if they say, I don't understand it, well, that's okay. It's real easy to say, well, they're just an idiot. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm sorry I ever gave it to them. But in reality, they're probably a pretty good test about how FDA is going to see it because FDA doesn't know a thing about your device. So if they say, I don't understand what you meant by, or I don't understand this particular component of, or that test report made no sense to me at all, that summary, I just got lost in it, take their advice and find some way to make it simpler, okay? And then a couple of small points. One is, write the summary, then the test, then tell them about the test report. I've seen quite a few summaries that will say, hey, attached are 5 test reports, and then give the test report names that have no meaning to the FDA. Here's test report DVT 1005-2. Doesn't mean a thing to the FDA. What's better is to write the summary and then say, oh, by the way, the details of this are found in such and so test report. And then avoid giving raw data if you can. Again, sometimes you have to. That's what's required by the agency. But certainly try to avoid giving a lot of raw data in your test summary if you can. Okay, examples of various elements in test summary. So it looks like we do have some time. I'm going to go through a few of these. I don't think I'm going to go through all of these. I'd rather end short and have time for questions. But so let's give the first one here. So here's we have two devices, device X and device Y, a handheld portable electronic consumer device. So we're talking about something I can't tell you about because it's a confidential piece of business information. But what we're about to show you are things that actually went to the FDA and were considered, no questions were asked about. The other one's a stent on a catheter. So an example for a purpose statement. It could be real simple. This test demonstrates that device X can be used in a high-altitude, low-pressure environment. Just cut and dry. The actual test report may have who knows how long of a statement, but that's all you need to tell the reviewer because the details are in the test report. Okay. Then sometimes it gets long. This test report demonstrates that device X can withstand 3 years of use. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, so now you spend a paragraph describing that really what you're saying is it's going to require 4,095 uses, but we'll increase it by 10% to have a conservative. Okay, so now you're explaining to the FDA why the test was use it for 4,500 cycles because that's equivalent to 3 years of use. The report may not say that, but you need to say that. Let's get to, let's go to page 40 here. Things about test articles. Okay, so for instance, temperature and humidity stress, 28 test articles were used, of which 14 articles had an additional component. Note how there's no sample size justification there. It's just that there it is. Same thing with cleaning. 24 test articles used, 1 for each combination of microorganism and cleaning agent, with 3 repetitions per combination. Okay, I sort of get that, but there's not really a lot of justification for the sample size. Why 24? No. Here, on the other hand, are some examples of clearer things. Given the test is intended to validate the device's fundamental algorithm, a single test article was used for all tests. The test article was modified to allow the recording of the software's output in terms of certain factors. Okay, so that's really clear. Look, there's a reason we're only testing one because we're just testing the software algorithm. Or this, the sample size of 30 was chosen based on preliminary testing that showed that such a sample could provide clear evidence that with 95% confidence, 95% of the population could be within the required specification. So now you've got a clear idea of sample size. Then here's sort of a vague one that we put sample size under test articles again. 7 were used, 4 articles had an added component, 3 articles had an on-off button for testing on-off durability. 3 of the articles had an added component using a lower grade of material. For 1 internal component, I mean, it was this messy, but it was all still legitimate because given the differences that don't impact the design of the device and the fact that the 4th test article did have all the correct components, the number of type of test articles was considered sufficient for testing mechanical durability. So again, it's messy, it's complicated. You might as well explain it in the test summary, and it's completely reasonable. Let's think about this. I want to keep our time on track. Let's skip ahead to slide 45. Okay, test methods. Okay, if it takes you more than 3 to 4 paragraphs or more than a page to describe a test method, you're probably going into too much detail. Some test methods in the reports can last 3 or 4 pages. You've got to find some way to summarize that because, quite frankly, the test method is usually the least interesting part. They want to know why are you doing it. That's the purpose. They want to know what your acceptance criteria is, and they want to know what the results are. The details are sort of, to be honest, sometimes the least important thing. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are. But so there's some exceptions to that. I found that when I'm trying to explain finite element analysis testing, it takes quite a while to explain what's happening, to justify the parameters, explain how to interpret the results. Simulated use tests can be complicated because the instructions for use may have 15 steps, and the test involves replicating every one of those 15 steps. And so, yeah, you've got to explain that we did this with the device, and we did this with the device, and there's just no way around it. Massive multi-part single test article type tests. So if you've got one test article that's being put through 15 to 20 tests because they're all in accordance with some ISO standard, it's just going to be a long test summary. But that's okay because you're saying, look, we did every single part of the test that's required by the standard. And then explaining test condition variations can also take quite a bit of time. So, and the other thing, of course, is, and I don't have a bullet here for it, but justifying your model. It may take several paragraphs to say this is why this is an acceptable model. results. Sometimes it really is short and it's pass-fail. That's what we always hope for, right? After describing 3 paragraphs of method, it's easy to say, hey, there was no degradation observed, although some test articles showed slight tipping and no clinical damage. So that's really great. But a lot of times the results aren't so perfect, and it's really important that you deal with it. That's probably the 5th or 6th time we've said that, and it's worth saying. So here's one. During rapid decompression of a high-altitude stress test, and during that rapid decompression portion of the test, temporary ballooning on the top housing was observed with all 3 test articles. I mean, that's what it said in the test report. We're not going to avoid saying that. The test report needs to say that. And then you say, but this result wasn't unexpected. Okay, so, maybe you need to go into more detail, but that detail at that point was sufficient for the reviewer. Here's one a little harder, okay? Mechanical overload stress. The acceptance criteria was 100 kilograms, and this is basically crush the thing up to 100 kilograms in a bunch of different directions. So here's what the results. A load of 110 kilograms was used for the test article. An extra 10 kilogram was added to investigate the margin of the device versus the acceptance criteria. That's pretty typical. You want to know not just did it meet the acceptance criteria, but how much margin do you have? When the test load was applied directly to the display panel, a cracking sound was heard. The load built up on the device gradually. It was estimated that the cracking sound occurred when the load had exceeded the 100 kilogram threshold. So you've got no proof, but no exterior damage was noted. The screen information was difficult but not impossible to read. The test passed all the other remaining tests, so all other angles of testing were fine. And so, therefore, the test was repeated, but this time only with 100 kilograms. And everything else was fine. No cracking sounds were heard. So not so perfect results. And Justin, do you have some comments? When we talked about this beforehand, you had some comments on this kind of testing.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of, you got some bad results, or at least results that failed your acceptance criteria, and you just need to write about them and explain it instead of trying to remove that test article from the test report or the test summary and replace it. I mean, I think when you hide things or move things away or call them outliers is where trouble happens, where warning letters happen, and where, your submission of your device won't get through the process. So that's a pretty good example of you had a result that was bad. You were trying to add a safety factor. It didn't work out, but you just wrote about it. You were upfront about it and moved on.
Yeah, and I think this to me is where a regulatory professional really has to be, for lack of a better term, at the top of their game. I think if you see something like this, you need to press the people that are doing the testing to make sure that you, as a regulatory professional, are fully confident that they're not trying to, put one over on anybody. I think we have to assume that people are decent, but we all make mistakes too, and we can cave into fear of, what happens, and I'm part of a team. And so it's important that you press and you ask and you be fully confident of that. But having become fully confident, now you have to go there and defend the team and say, look, if you guys are saying this is acceptable, it makes sense to me. We're gonna push this forward. We're not going to say, oh, my goodness, we have to do the test over again. We're not going to, because that doesn't make any sense. We're going to have to train FDA that this is what it's like. And to be honest, I think the average FDA reviewer appreciates this kind of honesty because it's just too easy to have test report after test report where everything comes out fine. And you kind of wonder, really, is it all really that perfect? It's a lot better when you're communicating to the FDA that you're just being upfront about how gnarly real life is, and let them experience that with you. I have not really had any significant problem with dealing with test results that were less than perfect when we had a statistical or scientific or statistical justification that was acceptable. It's so much better than simply saying, oh, that was an outlier. It doesn't matter. No, let's investigate, find out, and try to get an answer.
Yeah, good point.
Okay. So another not-so-perfect result, right? All test articles met the acceptance criteria for temperature and humidity stress. 3 test articles exhibited increasing weight after water ingress. They were investigated, determined to be unrelated to the device's ability to function properly after being subjected to a wide range of temperature and humidity. So, again, the test report said that. The test report had to say that because the whole point of a test report is to tell the reader of the test report, this is all the things we observed. But we made it abundantly clear that all of these things we observed had nothing to do with the acceptance criteria, and then we went on to explain them in the test summary. And that's fine. That way, FDA reads your test summary, and they don't flip out by saying, hey, what's this in the test report? Just tell it to them. Just tell it to them. Whoops. An error on the server there. We have a problem now. Let's try this. I can go there again. Not sure why we're not getting that. Okay, so I'm not going to go to that slide. I'm going to have to talk you through that slide. I'm not sure why we're not getting the last few slides too. Okay, so I apologize if you're not going to see it, but I think they're in the handouts. I'm looking at slide 50. And this is a real case study, a balloon repeat inflation test. The acceptance criteria for this test was the balloon has to be inflated 10 times without bursting. Okay, so you test 3 lots, 10 each, so that's 30 total. And so there's your results. Okay, you got 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, and then in lot 2, one of them went to 7 but burst at 8, one of them went to 6 and bursted at 7, one of them went to 8 and burst at 9, and then the rest of them were fine as well. Okay, so again, we'll do something dangerous for webcasts, and we're just going to remain silent for a little bit and ask the question, what would you do if people want to do chat? I guess Joanne's telling me that you can submit answers into Q&A or the chat. So let's talk about that as a team and or send me some chat on what you would do in those situations. What kind of questions would you ask? See if we get anybody to talk to us. I'm going to refresh my browser, as Joanna said. What happened?
Yes, you got it.
Okay, hey, great. We're getting some stuff here. This is great. Wow, lots of stuff. Okay. Explain the failures, right? Okay, tell me what's going on with these failures. Deviation section. Lot 2 did not pass the acceptance criteria. Investigation revealed what caused the failures. Good. Right, so say, note that 3 dice have failed to meet the AC, but here's why and why that's okay. So let me tell you the story about this as best I can remember it, because it was quite a few years ago. So, that's the first thing I said is, hey, so there's something wrong with that lot? And the answer was, no, actually, this is like the 3rd round that we've done this, and we're still getting this result. And, hey, by the way, Dan, we only test them 10, so we don't really know what the variation is, because some of these things could actually be worse. Better, sorry, much better than 10. So we're just getting stuck here. And in my naivete, I said, well, can't you just make the balloon thicker? Wouldn't that make it last longer? And they said, well, maybe, but there's 2 problems. One is that it's not going to fold down very well when you're trying to have it in the uninflated state, and it may not fold down well after you've de-inflated it, so that's a problem. And it has to go through a certain catheter size. And I said, well, can't you just make it for a different catheter size? They said, no, not really, because we're sort of stuck with what the existing catheter size are. We're not going to sell specialized catheters to go with this. We have to be compatible with those. And it became clear right away that these engineers were just frustrated and they were stuck. They were almost all done with the project. They've tweaked all sorts of criteria, design criteria, to see if they could make this work, and they were just stuck. And so we had a couple of further questions that I asked. One is, where did this acceptance criteria come from? And they said, well, it's vascular balloons. It's required by an FDA guidance. Well, where did that come from? We don't know, but it's what we've always used. And then the other sort of kicker on there is it's a non-vascular balloon, so you would think that a burst of a non-vascular balloon would be far less risky, but still you could see FDA arguing about it. And so we were sort of stumped. And then this is sort of this is many years ago, and the light bulb sort of going on. What we have a problem here is we don't have enough data. We didn't have clinical justification before I realized FDA used that term. So I looked at the engineers and the marketing team, and I said, I tell you what, talk to 10 doctors. Maybe 10 sounds like a good number. It doesn't have to be exactly 10, but talk to 10 doctors and ask them 3 questions. 1, on average, how many times do you inflate this balloon? 2, over the past 12 months, what's the most you've ever inflated any balloon? And then 3, in your entire medical career, what's the most you've ever inflated, any balloon in this situation? Okay, so they sent emails off. They got answers back from 6 physicians. It wasn't 10. But the answers came back as, well, the first question was 1. On average, they only do 1 inflation anyhow. Then the second question was 2. A couple of the physicians, a couple of times, the past 12 months, inflated it twice. 3, the answer was 3. 1 physician, once in their entire medical career, inflated the thing 3 times. So I said, I think that's a perfectly relevant justification. We didn't do a lot of sample size and statistical justification, things like that. Guys, I think that 6 is probably a fine number for an acceptance criteria. That's what your worst balloon is at. I think that's fine because that's double 3, and 3 has only occurred once in 6 physicians ever in their career. So I think that's acceptable. And that's exactly how we wrote it. We said in the conclusion section, hey, we didn't meet our acceptance criteria. However, it was arbitrarily chosen. Upon further investigation, and I wrote up exactly what we described here. FDA had no problem with it. Perfectly justified. So that's a really good example of how you deal with these situations. And we have one other case we wanted to deal with. What do you do when FDA demands a test and it's not clear what the acceptance criteria should be? This is not an uncommon situation, right? You send in a submission, FDA comes back and says, hey, we need you to do this test. And you say, I don't think we should. And by the way, how do we know we're okay? And they don't tell you. They tell you it's up to you to figure that out. So, Justin, you want to comment a bit about this?
This is a fairly common occurrence that happens to us. I think our first step is to communicate with the FDA to try to figure out really what they're getting at, go to literature and see if we can find any kind of clinical relevance or acceptance criteria associated with this new test that they've created or recommended. And then, the risk of an engineer getting something like this is it's going to make its way into our design controls without an acceptance criteria, which is a hard thing to deal with for any engineer. So just thinking about the long-term effects of that. So you try to push back and really understand what they're getting at with that. It could be from a predicate or previous device that has been approved or cleared, or it could be some safety risk that you actually missed. So I think more times than not, you'll end up going ahead and doing that test for how we classify as characterization only, just so you can finish that checkbox because, a test can be a lot simpler than doing a research article on why you don't think something is necessary. It's hard to prove a negative versus just doing the experiment. But there's risk both ways, and I think most of the times you're going to end up just doing the test.
Yeah. So, Sorry. So thanks, Justin. As a regulatory person, you try to avoid doing tests that don't have a meaning because you realize that it's just bad science to subject something to a test that doesn't actually help the regulatory person that you're submitting to make a decision. But, hey, they want it, and at some point you just sort of concede the point because the desire to get the product out there and actually help patients is bigger than the desire to be, quote, proving right. And so we had this situation happen, and it was part of an interactive review situation, and we said, look, we're going to do this test, but we're not putting any acceptance criteria on it. The FDA said, that's fine. Then we send in the test results, and they say, tell us why this is acceptable. And that's actually not too unreasonable because an acceptance criteria is a line in the sand. And if you don't know where to draw it, don't draw it. That's different from saying, we got the results, and they are acceptable, and here's why. But you don't actually know, could it be a little bit worse and still be okay? Maybe. Could it be a little bit worse and still okay? And you don't want to have to spend the time to go into that research mode to figure that out. So that's why sometimes you don't have acceptance criteria, but you as the writer in that test summary can say, here's why that result, which is just being reported for characterization only, is in fact acceptable without having an acceptance criteria on it. Okay. So we talked about examples for conclusions and just some examples of things, this result's deemed acceptable and provides substantial evidence things met the acceptance criteria, but except for this, but that's okay. So it's just, some language that we have typically. So that's the end of the formal presentation. It looks like we've got lots of stuff in Q&A. So, Joanne, should I transition to that, or do you need to do something else?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Dan and Justin, for your presentation today. And as Dan said, we are now open for Q&A. Please go ahead and submit your questions for the speakers into the Q&A widget. And I can go ahead and start. So our first question asks
do you want me to try to manage this? Sorry. Go ahead, Joanne.
Oh, sure. Do you recommend generating a test summary as a separate document or include this within each report?
Definitely a separate document. In fact, the way we typically organize things is test reports, whether it's bench, clinical, or otherwise, are all in appendices. And so the test summary or summaries all go in their own section. It's much more effective and persuasive, at least to my mind, to say, hey, let me summarize all 10 tests so that they're not having to dig into the detail yet. Make it easy for them. And so by the time they're done with those summaries, they say, yeah, okay, now I just got to go back and confirm that what I've read is actually true. Because, as soon as you send them back to a test report, now they get lost in the weeds. So test summaries up front, test reports as appendices. Okay, next question. Go ahead, Joanne.
So what do you mean by labeling supports test reports?
Yeah, I apologize for that. I think it's probably better to say test reports support labeling. But the reason I say supports is because the order that they're typically presented in is before you give them the test reports, you give them the labeling. So, the labeling statements ought to be congruent with matching the test summaries and the test reports. So, yeah, not the best of language. My apologies.
Thank you. Next question asks, when is raw data required?
Typically, in an animal study, large animal study, they're going to require to see the raw data. So, it's quite messy, down to looking at veterinary records for care of the animal. They'll want to see all that stuff because it's a different reviewer. It's a vet, and the vet wants to make sure that everything's been done right with the animal and nothing sneaks up in those records. So that's a typical situation. And of course, a clinical study that's being done for a PMA or similar submission, yeah, you're going to require it to include massive amounts of raw data. It can vary from time to time, but what we've typically seen is that any person who drops out of the study, they want to see all the raw data for. Hope that answers that question. If not, ask it again. What's up next?
All right. Next question does not pertain to summary sections. Do you recommend describing results before or after presenting data tables?
I'm not quite sure about this. I haven't thought about it this way. Now I'm reflecting on what happened in the past. Typically, the results section starts off with the results of the testing are presented in Table X, and then you present the results, and then you explain it. If you've got a few asterisks about why something didn't make the full number of cycles on something, then you usually explain it. So, yeah, you try to make the results section data, numbers. Pure data, and then you start explaining what those numbers mean. You explain, but you don't interpret. You interpret in the conclusions. Right. Yeah. Continue on.
Right. So next question asks, can you include raw data in the appendix?
Sure. Not sure I advise it, but yeah, you can do that.
Okay. Our next question asks, it's a long question. What's your rule of thumb about discussing test failures in a test summary? For example, the raw data may show an initial failure in 1 out of 30 tests in the protocol, but it turns out there was a problem with test equipment. The problem's fixed, the test is rerun, and it passes. Would you mention that in the summary because you don't want to look like you are hiding test failures, or would you not mention it because it wasn't actually a failure of the test article?
This is excellent. This is an excellent question, an excellent example. And it wouldn't be the first time that something like this has happened. And there's a way of dealing with that. In your situation, I would describe the test summary straight through, from purpose all the way through methods, all the way to results, all the way to conclusions, and focus exclusively on the second run. And then when I'd say see test report XYZ in Appendix X. And then I'd say, oh, by the way, there's a whole section of that test report that's not relevant to the device because something went wrong with the test method, and explain what that is. So what you're doing is you're setting up with a real positive message. You're coming to the conclusion, and they say, yes, I'm excited about what I'm going to read. And then you say, oh, by the way, there's something in there. I've had tests where I say, oh, by the way, this test report concerns two components, one of which got failed and got completely revised. The next text summary is going to tell you about the second version of that test once the component got revised. So you want to submit the entire test report, but yes, you want to tell them, by the way, there's some stuff in there that doesn't matter. But tell it at the end of your test summary. Okay, go on.
The next question is a deviation section not recommended?
Do we do that in our test reports? We talk about deviations, but we don't necessarily have a deviation section, right?
Right, because most of the time it's blank. Yeah, we usually talk about it in the discussion or the conclusion section, highlighting all the deviations. As far as in a regulatory summary?
Yeah, okay, so if a deviation means we did the method differently, yeah, okay, so that's in a test method section. You might say that. You might say that in results as well. Because you want to say this is the standard test method, and then you maybe put an asterisk next to something and say this one was done that way. Or you can talk about it in the method itself. But you don't necessarily call it a deviation. You simply say 5 were tested this way and 1 was tested that way. And then let the FDA say, oh, that's a deviation. That can be a tricky one. But there's ways around it. Okay, next.
All right. This person has submitted a biocompatibility report to the FDA, and the results stated that it was considered a severe irritant. And all of the background research that was done indicates this is a typical outcome, but the FDA did not like the result. How would you argue this point with them?
Continuing arguing. Although severe irritant, that's very interesting. We've had results where it's a mild irritant, and we say, look, all the rest of the testing has been just fine. That may be a little too specific. But if your scientists, your engineers, your clinical people, whoever you're dealing with, are telling you this is typical and it's not a reflection of the device, then you may be in good shape. You might also consider a different model. I'm just thinking out loud, a different model. But that's a hard question. So I'm sorry if I don't have an answer. Ask me again if you'd like.
So then a related question asks if you've ever experienced a situation where the justification that was provided in a test report was not accepted by a regulatory reviewer.
Yes. And you end up redoing the test. Sometimes you fight it if you realize that maybe they just don't understand. That's hopefully a good reviewer will give you an explanation of why they don't think it's acceptable. And if they don't, then you need to find out why, and until you figure out what's really going on in their head.
Yeah, we received the question before. If you don't have a method validation, please repeat the testing or deliver your method validation. So we'll receive that sometimes, but usually there's a back and forth, and they'll tell you what was wrong with your test or your test summary.
Next.
Next question, when you fail a test but realize with additional research that you had an incorrect acceptance criteria, Should you update your acceptance criteria or conclude that the failure is still okay?
Well, I think your design control is a living document, so I think you would want to rev that and update your acceptance criteria there. It depends on your logistics, where you are in your submission process, and how that's going. But yeah, if you're wrong about your acceptance criteria, that needs to be updated. And even after you receive clinical feedback, you can find out your acceptance criteria may need to be updated after you've already received clearance. And that's a living document. It stays with the device throughout its life cycle. So yes, update.
You know, I got to tell you, it was an interesting experience. I was talking with some senior FDA people at one of these policy meetings, and they were discussing when to change when do you have to submit for a change in a 510K, and there was a discussion about, well, if your acceptance criteria change, then you have to do a submission. And I just had to look straight and say, no, you don't understand. Engineers will write up acceptance criteria that have these huge margins of safety because they got to start somewhere. And then they're going to say, oh, something didn't pass it, and they're going to look at it, and now they're going to go into investigation mode and decide, hey, that was really too stringent. This is actually completely acceptable results. And so just because you change the acceptance criteria doesn't mean you're trying to sneak something past. I know there's a different sensitivity from what I can understand in the drug world, where if something's out of specification, you can't just say, oh, we'll test another batch or do another test. You have to investigate.
Yeah.
But a lot of times the investigation in the medical device area is, did that acceptance criteria make sense in the first place? You know, what's the difference between a 5x safety margin and a 4.5x safety margin? Well, it's the difference between 1 in 10 billion and 1 in 1 million. I think we can handle a 1 in 1 million failure rate, that sort of thing. So hopefully that helped. Go on. Questions keep coming in. This is fun.
So it was stated that the FDA loves tables. How should data be presented if the information is too great to fit in a table?
Put it in a smaller table. Sorry. I know that's a smart aleck answer, but believe me, this is an exercise in great regulatory writing. Find some way to simplify the presentation of the results so you can get it all into one table. That table might have, I did one table, it was like a page and a half because they had 70 different test cases. And sometimes that's just impressive. The FDA will say, wow, that's a lot of test cases. Okay, you beat it to death. So, sometimes you just got to figure out what's important and summarize that. And then tell the FDA more details are included in the test report.
All right. Next question.
I'm curious about that one. Unless they're concerned about confidentiality, I'd like to see this one. Anyhow, sorry.
The next question asks, when testing is recommended per a performance standard or draft guidance, but you feel a different or modified test is more appropriate for your product, what is the best way to explain that to the reviewer?
Up front. Yeah, that's why I say an overall test summary is a great way to do that, to say, hey, this guidance or this standard required 10 tests. We did all 10 of them. We did something different for test 9, and here's why. And here's why it's justified. So you tell them up front, and after that, you give them all those test summaries and those test reports, and they're just sailing through. And you might decide to explain that when you come to that particular test, but that's a bit of an art and judgment call. But explain it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, some of those standards and guidance documents can be pretty out of date with current art. So, yeah, that's a reasonable thing to justify and communicate with your regulatory agency before even doing the testing, to let them know that that's your strategy.
All right, great, thank you. Next question. This person asks, they've seen different approaches with different companies. Do you typically submit protocols along with the report?
Yes. You can always call up your reviewer and ask them what they want.
Yeah, protocols aren't always required. If your design history file has everything prospectively identified, you don't necessarily need a protocol. And if the methods are clear from a standard, you don't necessarily need a protocol. So it's not always a necessary thing. It does depend on how your company's set up.
Yeah, if your test report can't stand on its own, then you need to send in the protocol for sure. That's just a communication exercise, but I generally see little harm in submitting it.
Yeah, and a protocol can be pretty simple. It can either be like a service agreement or a statement of work with your contract lab or even your internal lab, or it can be the design history file too.
We got 5 minutes and 5 questions. Let's see if we can bang them out here.
All right. So next question. What is the FDA expectation for test method validation in simple Class 2 device mechanical testing, such as bending a plate, particularly when conducted following a standard?
So if there is a standard and there's a precision and bias statement there and you are executing that standard, you do not need to do test method validation. When there isn't a standard or the standard is a guide standard and there isn't a precision and bias statement, I think you would need to do method validation.
Yeah, a lot of tests are so simple that the method validation is just not that critical. But when it's a new or cutting-edge test where FDA has not seen it before, they're going to wonder, does this work? I don't think you really need to do a whole lot of method validation on a tensile test.
Yeah. It's when multiple companies are submitting on the same device and their test methods are different and there isn't a standard, the FDA needs some way to rectify that or to prove that your test is as good or equivalent to that other company's test. So that's kind of what you're looking at there.
Next.
This
I see one question. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
Okay. If you have an acceptance criteria related to torque values in your report and they all pass, yet you hear a noise coming from a device which is unrelated to acceptance criteria, do you need to document that in the report, or can you track and address that outside of the report since it is unrelated to acceptance criteria?
I suppose if you have a design control system that allows that sort of thing, you could do it. But for most people, it may be relevant, and so you'd want to include it in the test report.
Yeah, like is that noise or whatever's going on in relation to torquing the device? So you're torquing the device because it gets torqued clinically. So what's going to happen when a physician torques the device and hears that noise, and what kind of effect is that going to have on the patient? I think, I would have to know more for sure, but something to definitely look into there.
Okay.
Next question is asking, if you have a test summary, why would you include a test report?
Great question. Some branches and divisions within FDA don't require a test report if you have a test summary. Others do. If they require test reports, I would never send it in without a test summary. Otherwise, I'm afraid they'll get lost and they'll miss the significance. So again, it's a thing to call up your FDA branch chief if you've never dealt with them before and just ask them.
Okay, this next question has multiple questions. Trying to get a better understanding logistically of how the team typically writes the test summaries and how you'd recommend incorporation into submission. Are they their own separate document and one-to-one with reports? Each report has its own summary published. And then in 510K, would you just typically drop the info from the summary into the body of the submission and then include it as an appendix, or attach both summary and the report?
Yes. Okay, so for a 510K, you have this main, well, this is sort of a philosophy on structuring submissions. The main body of the submission, whatever it is, has to be a document that introduces the device, meets all the standard administrative and regulatory requirements, and then when you're done with it, that main body, the person should walk away and saying, yes, go ahead and do what you want to do, whether that's getting marketing approval or study approval. They should walk away and read that and have a complete story. Appendices are just for confirmatory and detailed information. So put the test summaries in the main body of the submission and let them read 50 pages or 70 pages or however many pages that might be. I guess with pharma, it could be hundreds upon hundreds of pages. But the whole thing is you want to have an introductory section that just by itself allows one to conclude that the device is safe and effective, or the drug is ready for this, or the biologic is ready for that, whatever it might be, and then let the appendices serve as details and confirmation. That's telling a good regulatory story. Did I get most of the pieces of that?
I will wait to see if they come back with additions. And until then, this is our final question. Would it be acceptable to justify not performing biocomp tests based on chemical characterization and referring to Ectotex certified material, or would the FDA always demand biocomp test results for a Class 1 product?
I can't predict how FDA would behave, but I do know that they are very in tune with chemical characterization, and I think if you believe it's scientifically justified, that's what you should do. There may be a business decision that you have to, you're not quite sure of timing versus cost, and I'm going to go ahead and do it, so be it. A lot of times chemical characterization is used for the more expensive tests. The FDA is sort of, why can't you do a cytotox test and a sensitization test and an acute systemic toxicity test? They don't cost a lot, et cetera, et cetera. But Class 1 device typically doesn't need genotox testing. That would be interesting to, maybe I should look over my guidances and see what there are. But yeah, so sometimes a combination works out pretty well. You still there, Joanne?
One last question in. Oh, actually, I'm going to go ahead and hold that and take it offline. We are over time, and I just realized that. So I'll go ahead and conclude today's webcast. And thank you to Dan and Justin for their presentation today and for answering all the questions that came in. And thank you, everyone, for your great questions that were submitted. The on-demand recording of this webcast will be available within 24 hours, and you will receive an email with the URL to access the recording. Thank you all for participating in today's webcast, and have a great day. Thank you.